Back everybody to this next video. Today is Saturday, July 11th. We are now 115 days away from the November elections. Joe Biden, as it currently stands, has a very substantial and rather safe lead over Republican incumbent Donald Trump, as we say pretty much every election cycle, but it really does carry extra weight this time. This is going to be one of, if not the most influential and important election in history, with a record-setting amount of turnout expected. So as we always do, we're going to go through all 50 states, west to east, and we're going to get that winner as we have 538 votes to characterize. Again, the first to 270, as you can see down here, wins the presidency. So let's start with the state of Hawaii, as it is the most western state, obviously, in the country. Hawaii remains one of, if not the single most liberal state in the entire United States. Of course, the state did elect a Republican governor a couple of terms ago, but that was sort of a one-off, a very moderate Republican, of course, who embraced a lot of left-wing policies as well. So with that said, there's basically nothing for the Democrats to worry about. That's a safe Democratic state, and it will remain that way for quite some time. By the way, it's not just Hawaii that's like that. Virtually all the territorial islands out in the Pacific Ocean and elsewhere closer to the United States on the other coast are very much the same. In the state of Alaska, now we've recently gotten some pretty interesting insight into what is going on in the state of Alaska. Some polling was finally released from the state, and it showed sort of a mixed result. I think that would mostly be characterized as a victory for the Republicans. Auburn University in Montgomery did a series of polls on the state, or rather it was public policy polling actually, that did a series of polls on the state that showed Donald Trump up by 3 points over Joe Biden. It also showed Dan Sullivan ahead by 5 points ahead of independent Senate candidate who was promised to caucus with the Democrats, that being Al Gross. And then, of course, the Democrats also have themselves a 2-point lead in the House race there to be the lone congressman representing the whole state of Alaska. So kind of a split decision. It was interesting to see that Donald Trump was up by less points than Dan Sullivan, who to begin with is not that popular a senator. Some other polls were conducted there that also showed Lisa Murkowski being one of the most unfavorable and disapproved of senators in the entire country. So with all that said, while this would normally be a very safe Republican state, I'm actually going to characterize this as a likely instead of a safe. Just because I think that the Democrats do have a chance on the Senate level, and +3, given that that's basically the only polling information that we have, is not too convincing for Donald Trump. So for now, I think he's going to be fine in Alaska, but unless he begins to turn things around both nationally and in the state itself, I'm going to label this as likely. Now up here in the state of Washington, continues to be a real liberal bastion and a big Democratic stronghold. Jay Inslee is up for re-election. He should be just fine. Maria Cantwell, Patty Murray are both reasonably popular senators, and we have seen the Seattle area, of course, be in the news a lot because of the partially civilian-occupied zone. Of course, basically every city in America is, civilian-occupied, as we know, but it has at least gotten into the news, however you want to characterize that politically. But Washington and its 12 electoral votes have really not shown any indication, even with a very large Republican presence out here in the eastern portion of the state, really everything outside of Seattle for that matter. Jay Inslee is very unapologetically and uncompromisingly far to the left on a number of issues, including climate change and tax policy, and that has not dissuaded voters at all. They clearly seem very receptive to that kind of thing, and so that, as a result, means that the first double-digit state of the evening is going to go to Joe Biden and its 12 electoral votes. In the state of Oregon, Republicans have been able to make a little more headway in this state than they have been in the state of Washington. In Washington, there are a few counties around the Seattle area that can sort of keep any Republican insurgency at bay, whereas in Oregon, it really just does kind of come down to Portland. for the Democratic Party. Jeff Merkley is up for re-election this year, but at present, as presently constructed, he does not appear to be facing any kind of real stiff challenge. So the Democrats should be able to retain that seat without too much difficulty. And again, on a presidential level, there's just been no indication that Donald Trump or the Republican Party really has any reason to believe that they can actually make any kind of extra headway on this state. And for now, that's going to remain a safe Democratic state. Now, California, obviously the biggest state in the country and the biggest electoral prize out there. It's 55 electoral votes. Now, the Republican Party, for what is generally characterized as a safe Democratic state, the Republican Party does manage to, they kind of hold their own in this state. While they don't necessarily come close on the presidential level, sometimes they can hit 40%. They usually come up just under 40%, around 38, 39%. But sometimes they can get around 40%. I believe John Cox, the Republican candidate for governor, did in fact reach 40% against Gavin Newsom. Now, while he did lose by 20 points, hitting 40% is sort of a good benchmark, for minority parties in a certain state to hit, just to maintain a good presence. And of course, several very, very, very prominent House of Representatives figures come out of the state of California. Of course, Kevin McCarthy, Devin Nunes, in the past, Dana Rohrabacher, Steve Knight, among others. And then there was a special election in California that the Republicans were able to win after the 2018 midterms and pick up one House seat after they lost 40 House seats in the 2018 midterms. So while the Republicans are able to at least be moderately competitive out here, and of course they did elect Arnold Schwarzenegger, a Republican, the reality is on a presidential level, there's absolutely no reason to believe that this is not going to be a safe Democratic state. And for really all statewide races, this is still a very thoroughly Democratic state, and it's really not showing any signs of that changing. So the Democrats are obviously piling up some votes here, 78-3. Of course, remember, on election night, it's actually going to be kind of the opposite of this, as most of these East Coast states, the polls there are going to close first, because, the state of Pennsylvania, of course, is 3 hours ahead of the state of California, just with the time change. But just for organizational purposes, we're going to go west to east here. In the state of Idaho. Now, actually, while this is one of the more safe Republican states out there, this is kind of a state to watch just for some trends that could be developing. Because down here, kind of in the southeast portion of the state, is, of course, Boise. And Boise, in the past, was basically like the rest of the state. It was just as ruby red as every other acre of land, for that matter, in the entire state of Idaho. But, Idaho, or Boise rather, has grown enough, and of course it is a college town, there's a major university there, Boise State. It's grown enough to where it now elects a Democratic mayor. There's a rather prominent gay community in the city of Boise. And so as a result, we have seen some election results that show the Democrats able to get upwards of 35%, which is obviously nothing to write home about, but it's at least worth keeping just like kind of one half of an eye on. Just because, as we know, in the state of Montana, Democrats are able to have a lot of success in the state of Montana, and of course in the state of Nevada. So in all these states, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington, that border the state of Idaho, the Democrats are actually quite successful, as opposed to Utah and Wyoming. But again, as of now, there's just no reason to believe in 2020, without a lot more time for demographic shifts to take place and for Boise to grow and grow and grow, and for more people to move in from the West Coast, to believe that Idaho is not going to stay very much in the Republican column. Now, in the state of Nevada, Nevada is always kind of a strange state because polling in this state always, without fail, overestimates Republican candidates. Remember, this was a state that Donald Trump was actually expected to win in 2016 and lost. Now, that was actually kind of predictable, just because Nevada has such a reputation as always being one of the states that's just pretty much always wrong on a certain level. And of course, the Democrats have had a long, long presence in the state. Of course, Harry Reid from years back, Cortez Masto, Jackie Rosen was able to unseat incumbent Dean Heller in the 2018 midterms. That was a huge flip for the Democrats in the 2018 midterms. They also flipped the governorship here with Steve Sisolak winning. So this state was home to a number of very important results for the Democratic Party in 2018. Remember, they already were in the minority in the Senate, and they lost 4 different incumbent Democratic senators lost their elections in Florida, in Missouri, in Indiana, and in North Dakota. And so at that point, the Democrats found themselves at a 10-seat deficit at 55 to 45, which is a pretty unhealthy position to be in present day politics when a lot of these votes are done strictly down party lines. And so the Democrats were able then to get a big pickup and flip this Senate seat, along with one in Arizona, from red to blue. They were able to get Jackie Rosen elected. They were also able to get Steve Sisolak elected. He was one of 7 states that flipped their governorships from red to blue. The others being New Mexico, Kansas, Illinois, Maine, and Michigan, and Wisconsin. I believe that was 7. So for now, Nevada, because the margins in the state of Nevada still sometimes can be a little murky for the Democrats, I'm going to say that's likely. But if there was a way to sort of, if there was one shade of the color blue here that I could label as in between likely and safe, that's what I would do. So I don't think the Democrats have much of a reason to really worry about Nevada, and it's 6 electoral votes. Now, in the state of Montana, this is one of the most fascinating states in the entire country. You see pretty much any state with just 3 electoral votes, as opposed to a couple over here on the East Coast, you pretty much know it's going to be a red state, and it is. Donald Trump won the state of Montana by over 20 points. However, Montana is a state that has a long history of electing Democrats. Max Baucus was one of the more high-profile Democratic senators for many, many years and was kind of a leader in Democratic politics until his eventual retirement. Jon Tester is a rather notable Democratic senator also from the state. And you kind of wonder, well, what on earth makes this state so different from the state of Idaho? Well, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, there is a bit of a known environmental consciousness up here in the state of Montana with the national parks. It's known for its spectacular nature and scenery. And people in the state of Montana are very intent and focused on keeping that and not losing that to climate change and things like that, or deforestation, anything of that sort. Even some of the Republicans are very conscientious of that kind of thing. And so they will, vote for Democrats that voice a certain concern about that issue. Now, that combined with a number of kind of wealthy California types that own second homes in the state of Montana, give the Democrats, are able to push the Democrats over the top. And they are always close elections, of course. But Jon Tester has now been elected to his 3rd term after a close 2018 race. And his reelection was important for the Democrats because, as we said, they had already lost a number of seats, but they played good defense in some other seats. One of them was here in Montana. Sherrod Brown was able to win re-election in Ohio, Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, among others. So Montana, of course, also has a very, very important Senate race that is on the docket come November between the governor, Steve Bullock, who was reelected as the governor in the same election that Donald Trump won in a landslide in the state. He is challenging Steve Daines, the longtime incumbent senator. So that's a very exciting race and exciting for the Democrats. But there's no reason to believe that on the presidential level, the state of Montana is not still a safe Republican state. So fascinating state to watch. But again, push comes to shove on the presidential level, nothing to talk about. There's even less to talk about in the state of Wyoming, probably the most red state in the country. And yeah, we're not even going to talk about this one. State of Utah. Now, we have seen some signs of life for the Democratic Party. This kind of used to be right up there with Wyoming. Now it's a little better for the Democratic Party, but it's still a huge conservative stronghold. Of course, it is the Mormon state. Mitt Romney was able to win re-election, without even really having to put forth any effort to do so. But the Democrats were able to get a House seat in the Salt Lake City area. Mia Love lost her election. That was in the House race in 2018. That was a very notable election that happened 2 years ago. Of course, Donald Trump singled her out in a speech he gave shortly after the midterms, pointing out how Mia Love, quote, gave him no love. And then we have seen some polling. One recent poll showed that Donald Trump was only ahead by 3 points in the state of Utah. So clearly, there's sort of a national mood that shows that, Donald Trump, as we know, no one's breaking news when we say Donald Trump is an extremely unpopular senator, or extremely unpopular president. And I don't think Democrats should really get their hopes up that there's much changing in the state of Utah just based off one election and one poll. That poll, of course, they remain, losing in. But as of now, with all that said, still a thoroughly safe Republican state. Now in the state of Arizona, this is a really interesting one for us to dissect here. This, for a long time, was another pretty safe Republican state. Democrats could be competitive, and they could send people to the House from the state of Arizona in the more liberal counties. However, Phoenix, which is now the fastest growing city in America, oddly enough, is kind of up there with Cincinnati over here in Ohio as being among the most conservative-leaning municipalities in the country. Phoenix, Cleveland, Jacksonville, another one like that. And so, strangely enough, that was what was able to keep the Republican Party in a pretty good position out here in Arizona. And of course, this was, the home state of John McCain. But in a very short period of time, the state of Arizona has really shifted almost entirely into the Democrats' column. And it all started in 2016 when Donald Trump won the state and its 11 electoral votes with only a plurality of the vote. And he only won by about 3 points. And that didn't really get that much national attention because obviously people were talking about his shocking wins in the Rust Belt in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and in other states like Ohio, North Carolina, and Florida. Even though those weren't really that shocking, the polls actually predicted those, not the Rust Belt, but the rest of them that I outlined. So in the state of Arizona, that was one thing for the Democrats to keep in mind, was their kind of promising result in 2016, and then 2 years later, Kyrsten Sinema was able to defeat Martha McSally and win a Senate seat down there. And that was kind of the start of a trend because McSally was then appointed to replace John Kyle, who was kind of appointed to also be a caretaker for McCain's seat. And well, here we go. That he is on his way out. And Martha McSally, who is deeply, deeply unpopular in the state, has a terrible approval rating, who was appointed by a staunch Trump supporter, Doug Ducey, to be the senator from the state of Arizona. She is getting absolutely walloped in the polls by Mark Kelly, the former astronaut, and of course the husband of Gabrielle Giffords, who is ahead in basically every single poll. And so that energy that we're seeing in the state of Arizona, combined with Joe Biden consistently leading in polls. There was one poll not that long ago, just several days ago, in fact, in the state of Arizona that actually had Donald Trump up by 4 points. That was a poll conducted by Gravis Marketing, but it only sampled 527 voters. Most of the polls in Arizona are taken a very, very small sample sizes. In fact, there was one that only sampled 200 voters or so from Change Research. But Joe Biden leads by about 3 points, according to 538. And I expect him to win this state. I'm going to say right now this is a tilt Democratic state. I think that Joe Biden could probably carry this state by about 2.5 points, and then all of a sudden, in just one long election cycle of 4 years, the Democrats have flipped both Senate seats and flipped it on the presidential level, and next up for them is going to be the governorship. But that's a huge win for Joe Biden. That's the first 11 votes, and to have flipped from either side, as he's now up to 95 electoral votes to Donald Trump's 19. Now, we're soon about to hit the red wall. That number's going to look a lot better for Donald Trump pretty soon. Now, in the state of New Mexico, this used to be kind of a swingy state, but now it's really not the case. It's a pretty safe state now for the Democrats. Ben Ray Lujan is running for the Senate in an open seat here. After the retirement of Tom Udall, he is thoroughly ahead. Joe Biden is thoroughly ahead. Big Hispanic population here in the state of New Mexico, which makes this a very comfortable win for the Democratic Party. I would expect them to win by over 10 points in the state of New Mexico, and that's another 5 for Joe Biden. He's the first to the century mark, now at 100 to 19. Now in the state of Colorado. This also, kind of like New Mexico, used to be a pretty swingy state. It's always been a little bit like that, but it continues to shift leftward. Now, Cory Gardner is sort of the last little bit of Republican presence in the state of Colorado. He is, in all likelihood, on his way out as well, as he is facing a stiff challenge, to put it lightly, from John Hickenlooper, the former governor who is running against him in the Senate. And this is likely going to be a Democratic pickup on the Senate level, and this is a crucial seat for the Democrats to flip should they want to flip the United States Senate, which is looking more and more like they have a real chance of doing. And so those things combined with, again, a huge national polling average lead for Joe Biden that sometimes reaches double digits. No reason to believe that Colorado is not going blue, even though maybe some of the margins and the final margin might be in the likely column. I'm going to label it safe. Again, this isn't about margins as much as I think it's just about where the state is going to go. Again, 48 out of these 50 states are winner take all, and so it really doesn't matter how much you win it by. State of North Dakota, of course, Heidi Heitkamp was able to get herself elected here, but she lost to Kevin Cramer in 2018. That was one of the 4 Democratic senators who lost their reelection campaigns. So North Dakota is not showing any real sign of flipping. Democrats can get over 40% here, but on a national stage in a presidential year, there's no reason to believe this isn't a safe Republican state. Same with the state of South Dakota. If there was any reason to really doubt that, I think Donald Trump kind of put that to rest when he gave that speech at Mount Rushmore. Now, Democrats, of course, I had a senator there not that long ago whose name escapes me, and the governorship, Kristi Noem, when she ran for governor, she only captured about 53% of the vote. It was a little bit closer than expected. So sometimes you can see how a Democrat might be a little bit more well-positioned in South Dakota than maybe even in North Dakota. But as of right now, the Democrats have virtually no chance in either of the Dakotas. State of Nebraska, same thing. Ben Sasse, he's up for re-election, and there's virtually no doubt that he's not going to win. However, we have to take a little bit of a breath here, because this district here is going to go blue, I think, at least. And that's actually a pretty significant one. This is one of the 2 states that we mentioned earlier that splits their votes, the other being the state of Maine. Down here, kind of in the Omaha-Lincoln area, is another district where another candidate can receive 1 of the votes. So Donald Trump is going to take 4 votes, whereas Joe Biden is going to capture 1 of them. And so that puts him, gets him from 109 to 110. But as we're going to talk about later, that's actually a pretty significant pickup for him, because that enables him, assuming he carries the other states that Hillary Clinton won, which we widely expect him to do, that means he can win by winning Arizona, Michigan, and Wisconsin, because that would put him at an even 270, and of course he's already won 11 votes in the state of Arizona. So Donald Trump is already down 11 votes from where he was in 2016, and 306, that's not that close, necessarily, but it doesn't mean you have that much to spare. Only 36 votes, and you've already lost about a third of them here in one state before we get to the real swingy states over in this portion of the country. So that's a big win there for Joe Biden. He's now flipped 12 votes that he lost or that Hillary Clinton was not able to get in 2016. In the state of Kansas, this is kind of another interesting state that we're seeing potentially, I wouldn't say change, but the Democrats, as I said earlier, kind of like in the state of Utah, have shown some signs of life. Reason being, Chris Kobach was the Republican nominee for the governorship race here in the state of Kansas in 2018, and he lost. And he lost by about 5 points as well to Laura Kelly. And that was an absolute stunner. Absolute stunner. No one expected that. No one saw that coming. And so the Democrats suddenly have a Democratic governor of the state of Kansas, which was a big result for them, and a big surprise and a big win. Chris Kobach, of course, is now running again for the Senate, Their primary is in August, and the Republican Party is feverishly trying to prevent him from becoming the nominee because that could mean that Barbara Bollier, the Democratic candidate, might actually have herself a chance. Um, I don't think the Democrats should get their hopes up about that one, but it's worth keeping an eye on, as Chris Kobach is far from the ideal candidate for the Republicans. But again, on the presidential level, nothing to discuss. Oklahoma is one of the reddest states in the entire country, and it went to Donald. Every single county, I believe, in the entire state went for Donald Trump in 2016 as we continue our way through the red wall. All right, now the second biggest state in the country, the Lone Star State down here in the state of Texas, my home state, just by the way. In the state of Texas, we are seeing some very, very, very discouraging news for the Republican Party and some very encouraging news for the Democratic Party. While it consistently is a Republican state, even at the best of times for the Republican Party, Texas was a state that was not, the Democratic Party was one of the largest in the state, largest in the country, which is incredible for a state that it's, doesn't have much representation in. The Democrats in the midterms were able to flip 2 Senate seats and 10 House seats on the state level, which helped them in the state legislature, which is now I believe the Senate is now no longer filibuster proof. Which is significant, of course, on the state level. And so in the state of Texas, we saw how Barack Obama was able to get well over 40% of the vote. Hillary Clinton was able to get close to 45%. Beto O'Rourke came within less than 2 points of Ted Cruz, and we have seen polls that have shown Joe Biden actually leading Donald Trump in the state of Texas. Now, does that mean that I think he is going to lose the state of Texas? No. Because I think it's just still a little bit too soon. But right now, according to 538, Donald Trump is up by 1.3 points in the state of Texas, which is incredible. Okay, there was a public policy poll that had Joe Biden up by 2 points. And then another one from Fox News, which is an A-plus rated pollster, that had Biden up by 1 point. Okay, the polls that Trump have won, a YouGov poll, Trump +4, a public policy polling poll that had them tied. Okay, so Joe Biden, and then a Quinnipiac University one from the end of May that had Trump by 1 point. Okay, so this is clearly a pretty competitive state all of a sudden. And so should the Democratic Party flip the state of Texas, it's it's a death sentence for Donald Trump. It's a death sentence kind of for the Republican Party in general. It's not to say that a Republican will never win the state of Texas again, but once this state becomes, like Florida, which it's not that far away from becoming, the Republican Party is basically going to have to devote basically everything they have into these 2 states. And of course, there already are a number of other states that they're struggling to keep up in. So right now, I think Texas is a tilt in the Republican column. That's obviously a big retention for Donald Trump, but I expect him to win this state by about 6 points, 53-47, and keep an eye on this state in the future. State of Minnesota. Hillary Clinton was only able to win this state by about 1.5 points. It's kind of a disappointing result for her, and early on in Trump's term, this was a state that his campaign was really looking at in its 10 electoral votes to see how they could potentially flip this and continue this sort of east-to-west domination that they had as they flipped to Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. They also flipped Iowa, Ohio, Indiana. Didn't get Illinois, but they were able to do very well in this portion of the country in 2016. But Joe Biden was obviously far more approved of nationally than Hillary Clinton. And given what has been happening in the state of Minnesota and in Minneapolis in particular in the last couple months, it's not a political statement, but it is no secret that minorities and people that are, more sensitive to racial issues in the United States are going to vote for the Democratic Party. We've got decades of evidence to support that. And so that's a disappointing blow for Donald Trump, because remember, he's already down 11 votes here, And we don't know what's going to happen in Florida. We don't know what's going to happen in North Carolina, and we don't know what's going to happen in the Rust Belt. Okay, so he's already kind of in bad shape as he's already lost 11 votes, and his approval rating and the national polling averages have him so far down to Joe Biden that this is a state he really could use to kind of right the ship a little bit. But as of now, I'm going to say this is a likely for the Democrats. Now, the state of Iowa, very interesting state here. One of the more elastic states in the entire country. It went for Barack Obama both times. It then shifted dramatically and went for Donald Trump by a resounding margin, almost 10 points in 2016. Both senators remain Republicans, including Chuck Grassley, one of the more high-profile names in Republican politics. But the Democrats control 3 out of the 4 House seats in the Iowa delegation. The fourth of which is kind of up here in the northwest portion of the state was for years controlled by Steve King, who didn't even make it past his primary this time around. So I think it's definitely going to tighten up. The governorship election in 2018 did tighten up. Kim Reynolds, who was the governor, was able to defeat Democrat Fred Hubble by a little under 6 points. So it's still a very competitive state. And there is suddenly a dead heat toss-up Senate race happening here as Joni Ernst is facing a really, really tough test from Teresa Greenfield, who is actually leading her right now in the polls. So with all that being said, I expect Joe Biden to tighten up the state of Iowa dramatically. But I don't think it's going to be quite enough. I'm going to say tilt Republican right now. I wouldn't be totally shocked if Joe Biden's able to win this state. Of course, when he was on the ticket, this state voted for him 2 different times, along with Barack Obama. But I would expect Donald Trump to kind of eke this one out like 51.7 to 48.3, somewhere in there. Because I think this is a state with a lot of independents, but there's very few minorities here. And I also think this could be a split decision where Trump ekes it out, but Teresa Greenfield is able to win that Senate race against Joni Ernst. Now in the state of Missouri, this is a kind of a misnomer as being a really, really safe Republican state. Barack Obama came very close in 2008 to winning the state of Missouri, but then he lost by much more to Mitt Romney in 2012, and then Donald Trump won it by over 15 points. But Democrats regularly get over 40% here. There was a poll that had Joe Biden up by 2 points in the state of either 2 or 3. I'm going to have to check on that. But there was a poll recently that had Joe Biden ahead in the state of Missouri. And while that does not mean by any stretch that he is going to win Missouri or even really has a chance to win the state of Missouri, it does mean, he was up by 2 in a Gerhard Yang Research Group poll. It does mean, however, that there's a little bit of bellwether stuff going on here. Of course, Claire McCaskill is the senator from the state of Missouri for many years, but she was voted out by Josh Hawley. So I'm going to say likely Republican. I keep missing that. Likely, there it is, likely Republican. Not too much reason to worry even after that poll that showed Joe Biden ahead. As of now, Donald Trump's probably just going to be just fine. So he's obviously narrowed the gap here, 120 to 96. But again, 11 votes coming down here out of the state of Arizona, and that's bad news for him still. Arkansas, one of the most red states in the country. It's going to be a safe state. Tom Cotton will also be just fine on the Senate level. Nothing to discuss there. Louisiana, also pretty safe Republican state. Bill Cassidy is running for re-election in the state. He's going to be just fine. There's really no evidence to suggest that in Louisiana the Republicans are going to have any problem whatsoever, so they're going to pick up another 8 votes there. All right, so now we're moving into probably the most consequential portion of the country that is really going to determine the outcome of this election, as the state of Arizona has helped do. So let's begin with the state of Mississippi. This is an interesting state right here because Mike Espy, the Democratic candidate for the Senate, came pretty close against Cindy Hyde-Smith. He lost by about 8 points, 54 to 46. That's a pretty respectable performance on his part. It's the highest minority population state in the country. And as we have said and established, African Americans, minorities, overwhelmingly vote Democratic in this country. And they're going to turn out because, as we know, there's been a lot of racial tension in this country this year. The president is known to be you know, a little rough around the edges, let's say, on that issue. And so that is going to push turnout considerably. Mike Espy, meanwhile, is also running again for the Senate against Cindy Hyde-Smith. So right now, I'm going to characterize this as a lean Republican state. I would expect turnout, incredibly high disapproval ratings surrounding Donald Trump, to push Joe Biden to within about 8 or 7 points in this state. Okay, I think he's going to be able to be pretty competitive here, and it's a state to watch in the future. The state of Alabama is a little bit different, though. Doug Jones is almost certainly going to lose, regardless of who it is, either Jeff Sessions or Tommy Tuberville, who, of course, has no political experience whatsoever, but clearly people are a little fed up and tired of Jeff Sessions, as he is expected to lose his primary race to Tommy Tuberville. Very similarly, of course, to Mississippi, you know, Democrats can crack 40% here, which is great for them, you know, considering these are very ruby red states and have been established as such for a long time. But for right now, I'm going to actually label this a safe Republican state. Now, in the state of Tennessee, this, of course, used to be a state the Democrats could be competitive in, but not really anymore. You know, Phil Bredesen, who is about as likable and electable a Democrat as you could ever find in the state of Tennessee, lost by over 10 points to Marsha Blackburn in 2018. So, you know, there's basically no opportunity for the Democrats to get this thing flipped. It's very surprising how much the state of Tennessee has shifted to the right in recent years. And that's a big development for the Republicans, because there aren't that many states that carry double-digit electoral votes for them to win. And again, having already lost 11 down here, this is a big retention for them. So I'm going to say likely, just because there is still, you know, there are still a couple big urban areas like Memphis and Nashville that could give the Democrats a chance, you know, if something breaks their way. But for right now, that's probably going to remain in the Republican column. In the state of Kentucky, Mitch McConnell is facing one of the tougher re-election bids of his career against Amy McGrath, who's a fundraising superstar. And there was one poll recently that had McGrath up by 1 point. And interestingly enough, in that one poll, I forget who did it, it did mention that when made aware of the fact that Amy McGrath supports term limits, her approval in the poll skyrocketed. So it was 1 point that she won by, but she likely won it by more than that in reality. So I think that between some better polling results and a lot of fundraising, McGrath is going to be able to at least be respectable, you know, in the final margins. I can imagine her getting 42, 43 maybe percent of the vote, 44 if she has a really good night. But on the presidential level, nothing to discuss. It's a safe Republican state. Another 8 votes. Donald Trump's column is now up to a full gross at 144 compared to Biden's 120. Now in the state of Illinois. This state has become a very, very safe Democratic state, even after the whole debacle with Rod Blagojevich. You know, the Republicans were able to get a Republican governor elected. They were able to get Mark Kirk elected. But that very quickly was resolved in the Democratic column as J.B. Pritzker was elected to the governor's mansion in Illinois in 2018. Tammy Duckworth, of course, was able to replace her, who now is at the forefront of possible vice presidential candidate consideration for Joe Biden's campaign. And so while in Illinois, the Republicans, like a lot of big Democratic states, have a presence outside of the Chicago area, outside of one big urban area, there's no reason to believe that they're going to be able to flip this state or even come that close to doing so. And that's another 20 votes for Joe Biden and a big win for him as he secures another 20-plus vote state. State of Indiana, Barack Obama won this state in 2008, lost it in 2012. It was one of 2 states that he lost in his re-election campaign, the other being North Carolina. Mike Pence obviously kind of pushes this one over the top, but the Democrats, of course, had Joe Donnelly, the senator here. He lost, so Indiana has clearly shifted to the right some. So I'm going to label this as a safe Republican state, unless we see some polling that indicates otherwise. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to come back down here and go basically south to north and then kind of curl this way as we get into the most consequential states in this election. So as it stands right now, again, Joe Biden has 140, Donald Trump with 155, still a lot of votes left, 243. So in the state of Florida, 29 electoral votes. Now, basically, we can put it this way. Similarly to Texas, if Donald Trump loses the state of Florida, he's not going to win the election. You can basically write that down. He won, Hillary Clinton came up 38 votes short in 2016. If Joe Biden is able to flip 29 of them here, he needs to win only one other swing state, and he is the next president. Now, we're basically saying the swing states consist of Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and then you can throw Ohio in there, and I'll even throw Georgia in there. If he wins any single one of those combined with Florida, the election's over, Joe Biden wins. And right now, he's winning. He is leading by almost 7 points and has won dozens of consecutive polls in the state. Of course, this was a state that Donald Trump won by about 100,000 votes, in a state where millions upon millions of votes were cast. The Republicans did have a pretty good showing in the 2018 midterms here. They were able to retain the governorship as Ron DeSantis was able to defeat Andrew Gillum. And then Bill Nelson lost to Rick Scott, who then ran for Senate. So the Republicans got some pretty good results there. Now, there were a couple good results for the Democrats. They were able to flip a couple House seats throughout the state, including some down here in South Florida, and the passage of Amendment 4, which granted the voting rights of 1.4 million convicted felons. Now, that has since been fooled with a little bit by the Republican legislature in Florida, which now says you can only vote if you're a former felon as long as you have paid all of your fines. So who knows what that really is going to mean on election day, but as of now, it does mean that more votes are going to be casted and likely for Democrats. So right now, because of the national polling that we are seeing and Joe Biden's his performance also in the state of Florida, I'm going to go tilt Democrat. And that is all basically right there a death sentence for Donald Trump, as he has already lost 40 votes between the state of Florida and the state of Arizona. And so he now has to flip a state that he lost in 2016. And when you look at what's remaining here, there's not much he can really do. In the state of Georgia, remember, Joe Biden is actually slightly ahead in the state of Georgia right now, 538. Once I get the information pulled up here. 538 has Joe Biden up by 1.7 points. He won a public policy poll in the end of June that had him up by 4 points. So does that mean I think that Biden's going to win the state of Georgia? Personally, I don't. Just because I think that, for a variety of factors, I think on a presidential level, the turnout is going to be very high, but without making a political statement, Georgia is notorious for being a state that disenfranchises a lot of voters and is also known for being kind of behind the eight ball technologically, as we saw with their primary performance. So I expect Donald Trump to carry the state of Georgia, but barely, okay, by a tilt margin. I expect him to win the state of Georgia probably by about 1.5 points. So that's 16 votes there. If he lost that, then there's definitely no chance that he can win. But he reclaims the lead at 171 to 169. Now in the state of South Carolina, not much to really be too concerned with for Donald Trump this time around in 2016 compared to 2018, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there is an interesting Senate race happening here as Lindsey Graham is up for re-election and Jamie Harrison is raising money at a just ridiculous rate. He raked in $13.9 million in the month of June, which is a remarkable number. But if anything, that's almost good news for the Republican Party, because anyone with half a brain can tell that Jamie Harrison is not going to defeat Lindsey Graham. And as a result, that's a lot of money that could have instead been thrown to Montana, the Senate race there, Iowa, North Carolina, Arizona, Colorado, Maine, among others. So on the presidential level, I'm going to say this is a likely state for now, and I don't expect there to be any real changes to that anytime soon. Now, in the state of North Carolina, another big tipping point state here, a huge high profile Senate race happening here. Cal Cunningham is challenging Republican incumbent Thom Tillis. This is a big state, a big Senate race to determine who controls the Senate. And right now, Cal Cunningham is leading Thom Tillis. That's going to be a close race, but right now, I believe Cal Cunningham is probably going to squeak that one out. Now, Joe Biden is ahead as well in the state, and this is a big minority population in the state of North Carolina. And again, as we know, Joe Biden is pretty popular among African American voters. However, even with Roy Cooper on the ballot, okay, who's a very popular governor, and a number of House districts in the southern portion of the state that are likely to flip from Republican to Democrat, I actually think this is going to be a tilt Republican state because Donald Trump was able to carry it by about 4 or 5 points, and I think that the Democrats are going to get the results they want to see out of North Carolina, but are not necessarily going to be able to, I think they just lost by too much 4 years ago, and they may be able to flip this thing by about 3-4 points, but that's just not going to be enough. I can see Donald Trump winning the state of North Carolina by less than 1 percentage point and retaining these 15 electoral votes. This was a big state that the Democrats had targeted that they miss out on. But again, having flipped Florida and having flipped Arizona, they have very, very little to be distressed about as we wind through the rest of this election. In the state of Virginia, Republicans have not won an election here in 10 years, over 10 years. Mark Warner is up for re-election. He's going to be just fine against Daniel Gade. Tim Kaine had no problem in 2018. This is going to be a safe Democratic state, even though sometimes the margins fall under the likely category or even sometimes lean. There's nothing for the Democrats to be worried about. They have all 3 branches. They have the full state legislature control here in Virginia as well. West Virginia is literally the exact opposite. It is about as safe a Republican state as it gets. This was one of the most lopsided victories for Donald Trump in 2016. He won every single county. Now, of course, Democrats can elect some very, very moderate Democrats, very conservative Democrats in that state, Joe Manchin, who was able to actually win re-election in 2018. And then, of course, the current governor, Jim Justice, who switched parties notably. So that's another 5 votes for Donald Trump as he continues to just try to stay afloat here as he's the first to hit 200 votes. Pardon me, getting some sustenance in here. Now in the state of Ohio, which of course was the tipping point state in the 2004 race between George Bush and John Kerry. Its 18 electoral votes are obviously crucial. The union presence of the Democratic Party in some of the urban areas of Cleveland, of Cincinnati, Dayton, Columbus, those are all big liberal strongholds, even though, as I mentioned earlier, Cincinnati is a little conservative as, big urban areas go. As of right now, I think Joe Biden is not going to lose by nearly as much as Hillary Clinton did. Okay, Hillary Clinton lost by almost 10 points in the state of Ohio. That's not going to happen this time. But similarly to North Carolina, I don't really see Donald Trump having too easy a time here. Sherrod Brown, of course, won re-election in 2018. That was a good result for the Democratic Party. And so, I think the Democrats are going to do a lot better. I would expect Joe Biden to outperform Hillary Clinton by around 5 points. But unfortunately, that's just not enough. So right now, I think it's a lean for the Republican. In fact, I think that might be the first lean, or the second lean, as we had Mississippi earlier. I think it's a lean for the Republicans. I would expect Trump to win this 52-48, somewhere in there. But don't be too surprised if Joe Biden comes out and takes the state of Ohio. I just think this, right about now, 3.5 months or so away from the election, a little bit more than that, Trump is still above water in the state of Ohio. Now let's characterize some of these northeastern areas. D.C., the most liberal area in the country, nothing to discuss there. Very safe blue. Maryland, same thing, very safe blue, even with the Republican governor, Larry Hogan. Delaware, Joe Biden's former state where that he represented in the Senate, there's another 3 votes there. New Jersey, of course, did elect um, Chris Christie, all those years ago, but it's since shifted a little more leftward as it replaced him with Phil Murphy. Cory Booker is up for re-election. He'll be just fine, seeing as Bob Menendez, who had quite a bit going against him with his legal troubles, was able to win and win comfortably. New Jersey is another safe Democratic state. There's another 14 votes right there, as now Joe Biden's also over 200. In the state of Connecticut, that's another 7 safe votes for Joe Biden. Same in the state of Rhode Island. Rhode Island, by the way, might lose an electoral vote based on some of the results that we get in the census. And then while we're at it, Massachusetts, even though it has some interesting things happening in the Democratic Senate primary between Joe Kennedy and Ed Markey, is unquestionably going to go blue in the presidential election. So now Joe Biden is just 36 votes away, and as you can see, he's only 2 votes short of where Hillary Clinton, or 2 votes ahead, rather, of where Hillary Clinton ended up. She finished, of course, with 232. Biden sits at 234. Okay, so with the remaining states that we've got here, this is the first. These 3 are the biggest ones, of course: Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. These 3 states gave Trump the election, but of course now that Joe Biden's already flipped the state of Arizona and Florida, it's not even that necessary for him to make this happen, given that he probably is going to win some of these other states. You can guess which ones. Now, in the state of Pennsylvania, of course, it's his home state, the state he was born in. Scranton Joe, of course, is his nickname. Donald Trump won it by less than a point. Okay, so it was clearly very close. In 2016, the Democrats, there was a governor election and a Senate election here in 2018. Democrats won both of them. And so as a result, that combined with Joe Biden being ahead in the polls, I'm going to give this a lean characterization. Which puts him now at 254, puts him right on the doorstep of winning, and that means that there's virtually no way that Donald Trump can win this election at this point. There are still enough votes outstanding for him to do so, but it's pretty clear which states he has a chance of winning and which ones he doesn't. In the state of Michigan, same exact thing as Pennsylvania. There was a governor election and a Senate election here. Debbie Stabenow was up for re-election. She won against John James, who, of course, is running again against the other senator, Gary Peters. John James is scheduled to speak at the Republican National Convention in August. We'll see if that gives him any kind of boost in the polls. But as of now, both Gary Peters and Joe Biden are very, very far ahead in the polls. I think this is the one that I expect the most to go to the Democratic Party. Out of these 3. Hillary Clinton lost by only 2.27%. Okay, just about 10,000 votes in the state of Michigan. I also have this as a lean Democrat, and there it is, 270 under this model. Joe Biden has won after flipping the states of Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Now in the state of Wisconsin, also, just like Michigan and Pennsylvania, a governor election and a Senate election during the midterms. Democrats won them both, okay, and they ousted Scott Walker, pretty high-profile Republican governor, as Tony Evers was able to win that race, and Tammy Baldwin was able to unseat, or rather retain her seat, as she won by over 10 points as well. So just because, though, there's such a low minority population in Wisconsin, and because it saw such a dramatic shift, and there was one recent poll from Trafalgar Group that had Donald Trump up by 1 point, I'm going to say this is a tilt Democratic, but it's very possible that the Democrats could win this state by 5 or 6 points. And so this is clearly kind of turning into a very lopsided win, as Joe Biden has already secured 86 votes that Hillary Clinton was not able to get from Florida, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. State of New York, absolutely no reason to believe this is not going to be a safe Democratic state. Andrew Cuomo, the governor, his popularity has gone up as he has handled the coronavirus pandemic. And that's probably just going to continue that way going forward. Polls consistently show Biden over 20 points ahead of Trump. Of course, even though he switched his home state to Florida, this was originally his home state. But another 29 votes in Biden's column. He's now up to 309, which is a larger margin of victory than Trump had in 2016. State of Vermont, very blue state, even with a Republican governor, Phil Scott, who's a very liberal Republican and very, very respected. Many, many Democrats, including Bernie Sanders, have spoken extremely highly of him. State of New Hampshire now. This one's kind of interesting because this was actually the single closest race on the 2016 level. Hillary Clinton was only able to win this state by about 2,000 votes, which is remarkable. Of course, this is a state with Chris Sununu, the governor, who's probably going to win re-election. And it was a little disappointing for the Republican Party, seeing as this is a state that they actually have quite a presence in. They've had senators there in the past. They almost won the state, for crying out loud. And it's a little disappointing for them that Jeanne Shaheen, who's up for re-election, is not being challenged by Chris Sununu. Now, it's possible, considering that both in Vermont and New Hampshire, both of these states limit their governors to two-year terms, that Chris Sununu could run against Maggie Hassan, who won by 0.1% in 2000, and I believe it was 14 or 16 rather. And so that could be something to keep an eye on. But Joe Biden is clearly outperforming Hillary Clinton, and if Hillary Clinton who was so unpopular, so generated very little enthusiasm amongst voters from all sides, from Republicans to independents to Democrats, if she was able to win a certain state, Joe Biden's probably going to win that state, and he's going to win New Hampshire. I'm going to say it's likely, just because the margins will probably keep this from being safe, but I'm going to say it's likely. Now, in the state of Maine, this is the other state, of course, that splits its votes. This is our last state to break down, the other state being Nebraska. It's a little confusing as to how this actually happens, but the two at-large, like the Maine at-large district, almost always votes blue, and safely. So there's 2 votes there for Joe Biden, and then I believe it's the second, I want to say, congressional district that votes blue, and that is likely also going to happen this time around. Now, it's this one, the first one, that Donald Trump was able to win in 2016, so that he was able to get 1 out of the 4 votes from this state, and I think he's probably going to be able to hang on to that. I'm going to put that as a lean, just because it's, we haven't really gotten much information, and probably because Susan Collins' favorability rating is so low, and this, of course, was one of the states that flipped its governorship from red to blue. That's reason to believe that the Democrats are going to have a better performance, but it doesn't mean they're going to flip that district. They'll probably just narrow up some. So there you have it. Joe Biden wins by 100 electoral votes, 319 to 219. He flips 5 total states. He flips Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, while also retaining some kind of wobbly states sometimes, as Minnesota and Nevada and New Hampshire. Donald Trump was able to retain the states of Ohio, North Carolina, and Georgia. Those were big retentions for him. But as we said, he also lost this district in Nebraska. So Joe Biden was able to win 83, right? Is that the total? 87 votes that Hillary Clinton, 87 more votes than Hillary Clinton was able to win in 2016. So thank you guys so much for sticking through this with me. I know this is a really long video, but we got 115 more days to go. Pretty soon we're going to come out with a new Senate predictions video. Please be sure to hit that subscribe button and comment down below with any suggestions you may have, and I will be sure to consider them and post a video about it. So thank you guys again so much for being fans of the channel, and I'll see you in November.